Hi there, Sam Moser here. Welcome to the fourth video in my van build series. This one's going to be all about planning the layout for the build. There's going to be a lot in this one, starting from why I chose to include what I did in the build, to looking at the layout in terms of systems and weight distribution views. I'll also cover other things that are important to consider, like airflow. Let's go. So before drawing out a layout or a floor plan, I think it's first important to come up with a list of requirements for things that you want in your build. And by requirements, I mean things like what size bed do you want, and will this be permanent or convertible? Are your water tanks going to be inside the van or outside? And if they're going to be inside, how big are they going to be? An initial requirements list really just needs to cover the big stuff. And I think you can think about this in terms of three different categories. The first would be structures. So your beds, your benches, tables, cabinets, kind of the big structural pieces. The second would be appliances. So things like your sink, your stove, your refrigerator, heater. And I use the term appliances kind of loosely, but items like that. And the third will be your systems that are going to support the van. So propane system, electrical system, your water system, because those take up space as well. At this stage of the build, it's okay if you don't have all those details pinned down exactly, but it does help to have a general idea of what you want in there for planning your space. And then as you get to drawing out some layouts, you might find that you need to modify your requirements list because there's not going to be enough space for everything, or you might just figure out how you need to adapt it accordingly. But by taking the time to write out a requirements list, you will ensure that you get all the items that are important to you designed into your layout. So now I'll put up the diagram of my build, and I'll quickly run through what my requirements looked like, and then I'll branch to the main topic of the video, which is a discussion on the main design elements and things to keep in mind when planning your layout. And in that, I'll touch on each of these requirements and why I made those choices for my build and what some alternatives might be. So my requirements were a permanent bed, at least the width of a full-size bed, stowable table with space for 2 people to sit at, and this one got compromised along the way. Next would be as much storage as possible, kind of split between some upper and lower cabinets, and then bike/gear storage under the bed. As far as appliances, I wanted to have a large sink, a built-in stovetop, counter space for food prep, fridge with the capacity around 60 liters, a propane heater, and a composting toilet. And then for those underlying systems, I wanted to have a water system with a 20 to 30 gallon freshwater tank, a 7-gallon-ish gray water tank, a propane locker that could house a 20-pound barbecue-style tank, and an electrical system with a decent-sized battery, inverter, and solar panels. So the layout I planned initially and what I built ended up being a little bit different. I first modified the layout to accommodate a different style of fridge, and then I modified it again after realizing I ended up not leaving enough open floor space and it felt a little too cramped inside. You can base a design off what you think will be best based on your current knowledge, but it's important to be able to adapt it and modify it as needed as your build progresses and you get new information or new findings. Another mistake I made was not overestimating on sizes for items I didn't know the exact dimensions of yet. If you're a seasoned van builder, you might be able to draw out a layout and build the van exactly as is. But if it's your first time building out a van, as was the case for me, then be ready to adapt and modify things along the way as you learn more about what works and what doesn't work. By the time I seriously started planning my layout, I'd already spent a lot of time browsing around online, looking at different van builds and how different people laid them out. And I think Pinterest is probably the best resource for doing this. From this, I knew I wanted a layout with a permanent bed across the back of the van. I didn't want a convertible bed that had to be made and stowed away every day. I also like the idea of the permanent beds across the back because they give you a ton of room for gear storage underneath that's accessible from the back doors. Just our preference. But if you want to have a big seating area plus a table, something you can use as a large workspace, then you probably want to consider a layout that has a bed that then converts into a bench plus table. So knowing that I wanted a permanent bed across the back of the van, most of the layout planning after that was concerned about the arrangement of all the structures in the front half of the van, and there were a number of factors that impacted that, so let's talk about those now. Water tanks. So water tanks can be located inside the van, or you can mount them underneath your van. In my build, I have both a freshwater tank and a gray water tank, and I chose to put both of them inside the van. By putting them inside the van, you can worry less about them freezing in the colder winter months. If you leave the van alone, especially for an extended period of time, then the tanks can freeze even if they're located inside your van, and you should empty the tanks and drain the lines before doing this. But while we're actively traveling in it, which we plan to be doing this winter, we'll be in the van and we'll be running the heater often enough that we'll be keeping the interior temperature high enough to prevent the tanks from freezing. As far as capacity goes, I figured the bigger the better, so we could go more days between needing to refill our freshwater tank. Of course, the trade-off as you move into larger capacity tanks is increased size and weight. I figured somewhere in between 25 and 30 gallons would be ideal, and I estimated that this should give us about 5 days worth of water for drinking, cooking, washing dishes, and general washing up with. I ended up with a 25-gallon tank, and the final size was really just determined by what I could find pre-made in dimensions that fit the space I had allocated for it, and that was in the garage of the van over one of the wheel wells. For the gray water tank, I wanted it to be small enough that it was easy to carry out of the van to make it easier to empty. I already had a 7-gallon aquatainer on hand, so I made use of that. But I probably couldn't have gone much bigger than 7 gallons before it would have become too big and bulky to easily lift out of the cabinet and carry outside by hand. I find the 7-gallon size to be decent for the gray water tank, but as a future upgrade, I would actually like to change to a larger gray water tank that's mounted under the van, just so we could go even longer between having to empty it. A shower. So I didn't include one in my build. But if that's something that's a priority for you, then there are many ways that you can fit one of these in a van build. Some people make a dedicated closet-like space for a shower, and other people have come up with more creative solutions. Keep in mind though, that besides the space for the shower itself, you also need to account for space for larger fresh and gray water tanks for holding the water to shower with, as well as for a water heater and additional plumbing. For us, not having a shower hasn't been an issue. We have a gym membership, which we also use for showering, and that's been just fine. Propane tank. So in my build, I needed propane for our stove and for a heater. Just like the water tanks, you can install a propane tank inside your van, or you can put it underneath the van. If you put the propane tank underneath your van, you can get a larger tank, but it can be harder to get these refilled, especially on a van. I opted to use a common 20-pound barbecue-style propane tank, which would be stored in a vented locker inside the van. These tanks are super easy to swap out when you need to get a refill. Most hardware stores and many other stores have an exchange for them. If you put a propane tank inside your van, make sure that you have it in a sealed off vented locker, and that needs to vent through the floor because propane's heavier than air. And you also want to install a propane alarm that's low down that can detect any propane leaks, because you don't want to have an undetected propane leak in your van. That's just going to be bad news. A 20-pound tank in a vented locker inside is also a cheaper solution than an undermount tank, but you do have to account for the space it's going to use up inside your van. Heaters. So heaters are pretty small and can fit in a number of different spots. I knew I wanted a propane heater, and I installed the Propex HS2000 in my build. This needs to be mounted on or close to the floor because it has 2 tubes that come out the bottom that need to be vented externally and out to the sides of the van. Even if it wasn't for this, you still generally want to install your heater down low because heat rises. So you want to be pumping it in towards the floor, and then it'll rise up naturally. Other propane furnaces, like those made by Suburban, are designed to vent externally through the side, not the floor of the camper. So depending on the heater, it can have different placement requirements. I think most of the gas and diesel heaters also have tubes that generally extend through the bottom of the heating unit and will pass through the floor. These propane and gas and diesel heaters, which need to be vented externally, are a little more complicated to install, but they're much more advantageous to have compared to a standalone heater such as a Mr. Buddy, and that's because they create a very dry heat. And all the products from the combustion process are vented externally, so you don't have any dangerous fumes or excess moisture entering into the living area of your van. I wanted to minimize the length of the propane lines I had to install in my build, so the biggest factor that determined where I mounted my heater was actually the location of my propane locker. Many people install heaters underneath the passenger seat of the van, since there's usually an open space there, so the location of my heater is actually very similar to that in terms of where the heat output is. One downside of this location is it doesn't provide any direct heat to the garage of the van, and there is some benefit to providing heat there, especially if that's where your water tanks are stored. So in the back corner of my van, I actually have an intake fan, which I installed to help draw fresh air in from outside, and it's gonna come into the garage area and then spread to the rest of the van from there. But now that we've gotten into colder weather, what I've done is I've actually flipped that fan around so that it's now an exhaust fan, and I run it just real low to help draw some of the warm air from the rest of the van into the garage area. Stovetop. So I wanted to install a permanent 2-burner stovetop as opposed to a camp stove that's stored somewhere else and then placed on the counter when you want to cook. A stove should be placed somewhere with good airflow to help exhaust the moisture, fumes, and other particles added to the air while cooking. Again, my preference was to have this located as close to the propane locker as possible to minimize the length of the propane lines I needed to install. In my build, I ended up combining the propane locker, the heater, and the stovetop all into one cabinet, which I refer to as the propane island. Sink. The next kitchen item considered in the layout was the sink. I wanted a big sink. I find small, shallow sinks annoying to use. The downside to having a big sink is that it takes up a lot of room and can eat up valuable counter space. So my solution was to build the sink in such a way that I could have inset sink covers that sit flush with the countertop so that the sink space can double as countertop space. With an undermount sink, this is pretty easy to do actually. As far as placement goes, the biggest thing I wanted to do was to place the sink on the same side as the water tanks would be. And this way I didn't have to run a water line that crosses from one side of the van to the other, which would mean having more connecting pieces and more places where leaks could potentially develop. Refrigerator. The refrigerator is a big item, but since the only connection it needs is an electrical connection, that means it can be placed in a number of different spots. Composting toilet. So I installed the Nature's Head composting toilet in my van. So besides an electrical connection, for the fan, it also needs a hole through the floor where it vents externally. Keep that in mind if you install the Nature's Head or similar composting toilet. There's still a variety of places it can go. Just take a look under the van to make sure there's no frame members or other important pieces where you want to drill through the floor to install that external vent. Next up would be the electrical system. I'm not going to go into too many details here because I'm going to be doing videos that are a deep dive on each of the systems, like the electrical system, the water system, the propane system, and these will include how I built them and what components went into them. On the electrical one, I'll also cover things like how I estimated the size of the battery and the amount of solar I would need. So be on the lookout for those videos in the future. Anyways, at the layout size, I just knew I needed to leave a dedicated space that'd be big enough to house a decent sized battery, an inverter, charge controllers, and the other associated circuitry. As a side note, don't forget about your roof layout and how much space you have up there versus how much space you need for vent placement and solar panels. Another aspect of the electrical system you need to think about is where around the van you need to run your circuits. And this is important because you want to be running these lines about the same time you install your framing for the walls and ceiling. Once you have a layout though, it should be easy to draw in where you want to place your lights and charge ports and all the other things that need power. Lastly was just cabinets and more storage. I wanted to put in sizable upper cabinets, but not so much that the upper space felt cramped, and same for the lower cabinets. Okay, so that covers most of the large structures or items that would need to find a place in the layout. The next thing I did was to think about these in two different contexts. The first being a systems view and the second being a weight distribution view. Let's talk about the systems view first. And by systems, I mean things like the water system, the propane system, and the electrical system. In my build, I kept everything related to the water system along the driver's side wall. The tank is under the bed along that back side wall, with the pump and accumulator assembly located in the rear corner right by the tank. From there, a tube runs up to the front along the wall to provide water to the sink, going through a filter first, which is in the sink cabinet. The gray water is collected here right under the sink as well. All the propane items and their lines are contained within the cabinet surrounding the propane locker, as I described earlier. The electrical hub is all together, and on the opposite side of the garage is where the water tank sits, but the wires go pretty much all over the place after that. With this layout, all the systems are pretty isolated and contained. To keep things simple, you don't want to have to crisscross water and propane lines from one corner of the van to the other. Also, the shorter the runs and less connections you make with these, the less spots you have for leaks to potentially develop. The next thing to think about is weight distribution. In a normal house, this isn't something you need to think about, but since this is a vehicle, you do. And you want to think about this in every dimension, up, down, side to side, as well as forward and backward. And you really, in terms of thinking about this with the layout, only need to consider the heaviest items here. Aside from the general structure, I knew that the water tanks and the battery were going to be two of the heaviest items. So the placement of the water tanks, both the freshwater and the gray water tank, was determined by where the sink was. So those both ended up on the driver's side of the vehicle. So then to balance that out, I put the battery on the opposite side. And the battery, I have a 200 amp hour AGM battery, and that weighs in at about 130 pounds, which is a little less than 25 gallons of water, which would be just over 200 pounds. But the propane tank also sits on the same side as the electrical system, and keep in mind as well that your water tank's not going to be full all the time. I built platforms for the battery and the freshwater tank right over the rear wheel wells. Having weight directly over your drive wheels will help with traction in slippery conditions. The upper cabinets are also split, so half of them are on one side and half on the other side. And, that's partially due to keeping the weight split, but also just because I didn't want to fill it up too much with upper cabinets, because then the upper area would start to feel too cramped. And I'm sure by no means is everything perfectly distributed in here, but it is distributed evenly enough that the suspension sits level without having to add any airbags or make any other modifications to the vehicle's suspension. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, one thing I haven't touched on yet is any exterior additions. And the two most common ones you're going to want to think about early on will be windows and roof vents. So my van came with windows in the rear doors, but no windows along the back sides of the van. And so I wanted to add a window to one of these sides so that we could look out of it and so that it could let light in when we want. I figured it didn't make as much sense to put a window right on the slider door, because if you want to let air or light in there, you can just open it, so I opted to put it on the driver's side. If you're really focused on building a stealth camper, then you probably don't want to put any windows in, because the more you add, the more it starts to look like a camper versus just a cargo van. Besides being able to look out them or letting light in, probably the most important thing that windows do is allow more airflow to pass through the van. So in general, you put a roof vent fan in, and most of the time you'll probably run that as an exhaust. It's pulling air out. But unless you have an opening for new air to come in from, it's not going to be very effective. So most windows that you want to put in a camper will open and have a screen and are a good inlet for letting air in. You want to consider the placement of the roof vent fan in relation to the rest of the layout. So for me, I figured I could put it towards the front for better airflow while cooking, or towards the back for better airflow over the bed while sleeping. When cooking, it's important to run the fan as an exhaust to remove moisture added to the air from cooking and to remove odors and other airborne particles created while cooking. I put mine towards the front near the kitchen area, and I think the placement worked well for this. When using the stove, we turn the fan on and either open the slider door a little to let some air in, or open the window, which is situated by the sink just across from the stove. Either of these seems to work to create good airflow while cooking, although we do set the smoke alarm off sometimes if we don't have the fan set high enough while cooking. Since the fan is positioned towards the front though, we don't get as good of airflow over the bed in the back. To help with this, I had added a fresh air intake fan in the back corner of the van. And basically what that is there's a 4-inch hole that goes through the floor in the rear corner of the van, up a little ducting to an inline fan. And that works some, but it doesn't let nearly as much air in as I was hoping it would. I think the best configuration really would be to have one roof vent fan in the front and one roof vent fan in the back. You could set one as an intake and one as an exhaust and really create good circulation with both of those. And you do see that in some vans, but you don't see it in the majority of them. The majority of the time, you normally just see one. I also think it really depends on what kind of weather you're going to be staying in most of the time. Now that it's gotten cooler, the not having as good airflow in the back hasn't mattered at all. It was just when we were in some warmer temperatures where I think that would have made a big difference. But if you do only put in one roof vent fan, just make sure you think about where you have another inlet for letting air in. And as I said, this could be a window or an intake fan. There's different options for that. I actually think a window towards one of the back sides by the bed would have probably been the most effective thing for then pulling air in over the bed and then letting it out that roof vent. I mentioned that you need airflow to remove moisture added to the air while you're cooking, but really you want to have airflow and circulation throughout the van almost all the time. There's so many different things that you do in here that'll add moisture to the air, whether that's leaving a wet towel out to dry or just being in here breathing. In such a small space, you don't want it to get too humid in here because that'll lead to excess condensation building up in the walls of the van, which will lead to other problems down the road. So the best thing to deal with this is just to have good circulation to keep fresh air moving through and to pull any moist air from inside the van out. So airflow is a big one to think about. Okay, so I'll put up the diagram of our final layout again, and after traveling in it for more than 2 months, we've been happy with it. So that's going to do it for this one. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video and found it useful, click the thumbs up button below and maybe share it with someone else who might enjoy this kind of content. There's going to be more videos on my build coming soon, so subscribe to my channel and be on the lookout for those. See you next time.